Hey, this is Ivan Velez Jr. here, about to tell you about the Milestonians. So, back when I was a kid, there were a lot of comic books, and I fell in love with all of them. From the Casper stuff, to the DC comic stuff, to the Superman family, to the Batman family, to even some of the new like Marvel stuff that was talking about real life issues mixed with all that bam boom pow. But there was something missing that I didn't really think about, but I could feel. And now I kind of realize all the characters that I read about, all those Archie comics and kid comics and fun science fiction comics and all those like heroes that I loved and read about and wished to be were one color. There were only one type of people. There were only one type of hero. There was no one that looked like me or my family or my friends or anyone in my block. There was no one from the place where my parents came from. There was no black, no brown, no Asian, no real interesting diversity in any of the comic books that I read, which made me feel kind of weird when I realized it. And why was that? Why weren't there characters of color in any of those wonderful stories that we just ate up all day long, every day? Why couldn't I have a hero of color that looked like me or my friends? And why was that so unfair? And how unfair that is that a little kid cannot even see themselves reproduced on these four color pages that's intended for kids, intended to create heroes, intended to for them to have fun and lose themselves into. Well, little by little, things started changing. And here are a few of those changes. So let's talk about some real milestones in comics history. I think the first important one is the Yellow Kid. He's the first character to keep reappearing. He's the first character to come out of that brand new technology of newspapers back before the turn of the last century. I mean, he appeared over and over again. He became very popular, and the Yellow Kid became the first real, true American comic book character. Another important milestone is the birth of the American superhero archetype. Superman coming in Action Comics, Batman coming from Detective Comics, and Wonder Woman coming from Sensation Comics. These three characters, often repeated, spawned thousands and thousands of lookalike characters, and are still the top three today. Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy actually changed the face of Japanese comics forever, bringing it into the international market, making it a global superstar, and even bringing anime to America for the first time in 1964 with Astro Boy. Of course, the explosion of Marvel Comics in the early 1960s brought a huge change to the whole industry of comic books in America, bringing superheroes that had actually real life problems, real life family structures, and stories that the reader could really relate to. The first appearance of Franklin in the Peanuts comic strip in 1967 was a huge milestone, believe it or not. This gave permission to cartoonists all over the world and the syndicates to actually integrate the characters, integrate the strips, and actually have different people of color featured in the stories. Remember, this was during the civil rights movement, and even Charles Schulz had a tough time, kind of like convincing himself that it was the right thing to do. He was very scared that he would be seen as either using a token or that he wasn't the person to kind of like break this kind of ground. But he did, and it did. Hey, the first appearance of Jack Kirby's Black Panther brought a lot of change to Marvel Comics, even. Marvel Comics, who was known for kind of like being with it and really speaking to the reader in language of his time, finally brought in integration in his characters and brought in the Black Panther. And even Black Panther had his own problems getting in there at first, but Jack Kirby kept pushing it, and here he is today, one of the biggest characters in the world. Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams brought a lot of real life issues into their Green Arrow, Green Lantern comics. Stuff that was kind of hard to read sometimes. Stuff that talked about real life, like race relations and anti-war protests and all sorts of things that were like really, really strong during the '60s. Of course, the milestone that I remember most from 19 years was the launch of the Giant Size X-Men #1, a revamp and relaunch of the original X-Men series, which featured a multicultural and beautifully powerful cast. It just kind of rocked the entire world because all of a sudden teenagers could see themselves reflected in a lot of these characters. Mouse, of course, brought the graphic novel and cartooning to an adult literary level, gaining mad respect for the art form. That's still there today. The Death of Superman in the '90s brought a lot of change in the industry. It gave a lot of companies the bravery to start. It gave the creators, who a lot of them who worked for Marvel before, to break out of their unfair royalty situation and create an ownership situation, actually create their own characters and own companies. They also changed the business structure that kind of like, it kind of brought in the death knell of like the super popular comic books. Back when I was a kid, you can get a comic book in candy stores and drugstores and on the subway kiosks and just anywhere you can find a comic book to buy, just off the rack. But after the death of Superman, the big companies got together and they colluded, and they made sure that you could only buy the comic books from specialty shops and took it out of general distribution. And that, although at first may have seemed like a smart idea for themselves and to keep more of the profits and to kind of prevent the returns if they weren't sold, it kind of brought forth an attitude and kind of like a futility to getting comic books. So like kids couldn't afford comic books the way they were forced to be really expensive because of this change. And they couldn't find even comic books. So who's to know? Maybe the death of Superman will eventually see the death of American comic books itself in our lifetime. There were milestones in gender diversity and sexual orientation and representation, as all of a sudden gay and lesbian characters and transgender characters can come and not only be featured in stories, but also have love and acceptance by the peers and even marry on the panel. And that's kind of an important change right there. Another amazing change in comics, another milestone, was the birth of multiculturalism as an accepted standard for comic book companies. Marvel and DC Comics all of a sudden started including diversity, not only of race and ethnicity, but of gender, of body types. It became a thing. Ms. Marvel actually being the first Muslim superhero to be published in her own book in Marvel Comics. Miles Morales, who became a twofer, being Latino and Black, and actually having a huge movie to kind of push him up into the national spotlight. A wonderful character that we were all very proud of. And even stuff like Faith, characters out there with different body types who could be idols as well, fighting those stereotypes of these like lean, muscular bodies that we always see over and over again. And what's most important about this changing is that all of a sudden, writers of color, artists of color, colorists of color, creators of color were allowed to create and share in that spotlight in the mainstream. But as wonderful as this all stuff is and how new and refreshing it feels, just remember that one company really, really kind of broke all the ground back all the way back in the '90s, a little bit after the death of Superman. And this company is called Milestone Media. So Milestone started actually creating an entire universe of characters of color, superheroes, good and bad, scientists, magical people, people that came from the ghetto, people that came from the suburbs, all sorts of folks showing a true diversity in the type of people of color there are in the world, and not just that one, one tone that they use in every like mainstream comic book before. And it was a wonderful thing because not only did they create all these new characters, they hired people of color to actually write about people of color, which was like a new concept back then. Um, Marvel, DC, and a lot of the mainstream companies were not really famous for diversity. In fact, it was a pretty tough game to get into, but it seemed to default to a certain type of writer. And I would say like 90% of the writers and artists, 90, maybe even 95% or even higher, were not people of color. Um, thank God there were like trailblazers like George Perez out there who basically, if you ever saw a Marvel movie like the Avengers or even Wonder Woman, it has his style and his pacing all over it. Um, but what a wonderful concept that people had a chance to kind of put their own background into the heroes and stories and create something so authentic and interesting. Hi, this is Joe Illidge, who's one of the people who started at Milestone. Your career started really early on when you were an intern and you went up to editorial, and now
Right.
you're a superstar in mainstream comics.
Oh, okay.
You are pretty good. What company are you working for right now?
Right now, I am working at Heavy Metal Magazine.
Yeah, which is pretty nice. And I saw
Thank
a
you.
lot of the covers of the books, and they look really beautiful. And good job, Joe. Joe.
Thank you very much.
So there's a question. How do you think Milestone changed the game when it came out?
Milestone's specific deal was that it was a publishing company and DC Comics, handled the distribution.
Hmm.
And that was the first company that I saw that had a deal like that. Now, I think that came down to the fact that Milestone had the resources to create something that DC could not create, right? So, for example, yesterday in the Washington Post, there was an article about a small publisher called Unique Studios, um, that is run by a Nigerian man. He has all Nigerian characters, Nigerian creators. He's been crowdfunding for 5 years. And there was an announcement yesterday in the Washington Post that Dark Horse is now going to publish his books. They're going to publish the entire backlist from the last 5 years, and then they're going to publish new material, right? And that comes down to the fact that he already established something that it would take Dark Horse years to create, right? So basically, Milestone and DC, I think, had a similar relationship. DC, for all of their financial resources, had maybe only one Black person in their editorial department at the time, had very few Black characters, maybe a dozen at the most. So they wouldn't have been able to create a Milestone themselves. So creating the kind of business arrangement that they did, I feel like that was the first of its kind, and then would lead to what we're seeing now, literally, what are we talking, 28 years later, right? So
Yes.
that's one way in which I think they did change the landscape, is that by virtue of what they were able to do, they were able to get into business with a highly established partner with a reputation and resources and a long history of publication.
Milestone Media was launched in 1993 by four individuals with a vested interest in comics. Dwayne McDuffie, Derek Dingle, Michael Davis, and Denys Cowen. Four people who are the final four of Milestone Media, even though other people joined in earlier, different stages. But at the final point of publication, those four were the final four, and are forever remembered as the creators of Milestone. They start out with four books: Hardware, Icon, Blood Syndicate, and Static, all featuring characters of color who are powerful, who are beautiful, who are amazing, who had stories that were true to their characters and to their situations and to the reality of America in the 90s. Hardware with a solo superhero, a bit reminiscent of Iron Man. Icon, bit of a Superman there with a partner who was very unique. We'll talk about her later. Blood Syndicate, their team book, and Static, their young hero, um, with a flavor of Spider-Man during the early days. Now, these characters were iconic. They used all the superhero tropes. They were wonderful reads. They were very colorful and designed beautifully, drawn beautifully by mostly artists of color, colored beautifully, written mostly by people of color, and produced by people of color. And that's what's the most important thing. Their diversity in the talent actually paid off in the diversity of the stories and the true feeling of the stories. They will all feature characters who were wonderful heroes, true to their identities, realistic in their own world and their own points of view, which were very different. Icon, which kind of copied a bit of the Superman story, was actually an alien from another planet who was raised by slaves during the slave era, an immortal super being who actually turned into a Republican, believe it or not, a conservative. And his sidekick is a young Raquel Irvin, known as Rocket, who became a bit of a star in her own right and became the first pregnant teenage superhero. And her issues were always really, really talked about, discussed by everyone in the book. The whole situation just felt true to life and was a real testament to Dwayne McDuffie, one of the co-creators, the head publisher, and the writer, the lead writer of all the books in the beginning. The lead designer on all the books was Denys Cowen, who had this beautiful, authentic, real look that was true to not only people of color, but just true to like reality and people in general. Everything was just done right. MD Bright was the artist on Icon. The lead artist was amazing. His work still stands to this day. Chris Cross, who came on the third issue of Blood Syndicate, actually broke that book's back and was amazing in that book. Static had John Paul Leon, who came in there and just made it so beautiful, went on to Shadow Cabinet and other titles, and it's still a superstar today. And even Wilfred came in on the second half of the book's run and did some beautiful, beautiful work. And of course, Denys Cowen, who always stuck with hardware as the lead artist there, created some beautiful, beautiful designs that are classics today. We had a second run of comic books after the first four: Shadow Cabinet, Zombie, Cobalt, and Heroes. Again, reflecting some true realities in our world in a beautiful new way. The staff of Milestone was in love with Milestone. Everyone loved each other. Everyone loved the mission, the cause to show true diversity in comic books where it was missing before, the cause to create different types of characters, the cause to just kind of represent and show the world that yes, people of color can write great comics, can create great comics. And they did. They really did.
Oh,
This
great.
is Erica Helene. Actually, she's actually Erica Wells right now, but she was Erica Rodriguez and Erica Helene. And
Helene.
Helene.
I love
Helene. Yeah.
it. Makes you like a comic
That's
character.
my middle name, actually.
Ah,
Oh, okay.
How many names do you have, Erica?
Yeah.
she had
You got
one.
a lot of names.
I have 4. I have a lot of names.
But yeah, could you know?
I went by Helene because I was, it wasn't cool to be Latina back then. I had real identity issues. And so I used Helene because, you know, back then, you know, you have people like Raquel Welch, who's Hispanic, but wasn't owning up to it, you know, and, you know, the Rita Morenos of the world were less emphasized. You know, she was too ethnic, you know, and I was embarrassed because I had some issues with people not knowing how to pronounce Rodriguez, you know, and I said, okay, I'll use Helene and that'll be that, you know. So yes, I am a Latina and I'm trying to get used to it.
But you know, it's kind of true because I remember working with a lot of artists in Marvel who you didn't know were Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
You know, like the Ghost Rider artists, like 2 of them that
Oh, really?
are pretty famous, but that weren't Puerto Rican, including an artist I worked with at DC who did the Eradicator, and he told me he was Puerto Rican. But
Oh,
the guy who did he did the pencils on the Eradicator miniseries I did with over there.
Oh, that's why back in the days.
back in the days in the 90s, but I didn't know. And it's like, I saw with like Joe James as well, that people really are not really
Yeah.
Spanish names, and there must be a problem in the industry. And then when I see the kids, they say, how come they're not like 10 years of Marvel movies? How come there's not one Latino superhero? And it's like, there must be an issue going on in the industry. So
Yeah, as when I was a kid, they used to color Hispanic characters green because olive skin. And
Really?
somehow that, yes, seriously, like the bad guys would be olive skinned and they were green olive skinned.
oh,
And that's how you knew they were Hispanic. So it was just really weird, you know? So, I mean, when X-Men came around, and I didn't start reading Marvel's comics until I was 16. I was reading, you know, DC's and Harvey's when I was a kid, and Archie's, but I didn't really know about Marvel comics and X-Men until I was in high school. And when the X-Men were around, it's like, oh, people of color. Look, I've got Storm and New Mutants. I loved New Mutants because Bill Sienkiewicz was on it. I started reading it with Bill Sienkiewicz's run on, I think it was Demon Bear.
yeah.
Yeah, the best part.
Oh my
best one.
goodness, his artwork just blew my mind. And
Mhm.
I thought, you know, because I've been reading comics since I was a kid, and I'm like, you know, there's Sunspot. He's Brazilian, he's dark. You know, we have Storm, and we have Danny, Moonstar, you know, so like suddenly there were like, you know, brown people, and that was cool because it was not your typical, like, you want to be a superhero,
Mhm.
but you don't really see anyone that definitely doesn't have, you know, a regular name, you know, like, you know, I don't want to put anybody's name down, you know, but, you know, easy to pronounce names, shall we say.
Mhm.
And, you know, for me anyway, and I'm probably jumping the question, but for me, you really can only see the impact of Milestone in hindsight, because
Right.
it's for once, if you'd ever dreamed about being a superhero, and most of the superheroes were light-skinned, you know, white people, suddenly you had a whole universe created by people of color, and that were people of color, and were regular people, like the ones that lived down the street or down the apartment building, you know, down your floor, you know, and there's something about that, seeing a kid wrestle with, you know, like when Rocket had to decide about, you know, she gonna keep her baby.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, that's not what superheroes talk about, but that's real life stuff, you know.
Mhm.
And Blood Syndicate, you know, that was so intense, you know,
Mhm.
just normal people trying to cobble together a family out of their friends, you know, because that's all they have.
Mhm.
That there's something about that, hearing what's happening around you, and helping you kind of cope. And it was great to have Static, because it was great to have a normal kid have a normal life and
Right.
be a superhero, you know.
Milestone, being a real publisher, published miniseries, Death Wish, Holocaust, and Wise Son. Wise Son, who was written by Ho Che Anderson, who actually created the biographical comic book of Martin Luther King. Death Wish featured a transgender character, written by a person who was transgender. And of course, Holocaust, you know, written by yours truly. This is Jackie Ching. Jackie Ching was one of the editors of Milestone Media when it first came out, and she's a great joy to be with, and finally remembered by every member of Milestone Media, and still is. And we're so happy to be able to talk with her today. But one question I have for you, Jackie, you know, we're talking about the presence of people of color in Milestone Media and how important it was that a kid can actually see that reflected. But you've come from a culture, your family's from Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and in Hong Kong, all the comic books are about Asian people, which are kind of cool. And I see so many beautiful images there. But when you came to America and you started working in the industry, and what was kind of like the difference between the way Milestone handled people from Asia than the way the regular mainstream media probably dealt with them. What do you see?
Well, I would like to insert that I actually grew up in the Philippines.
Ah,
And actually, the comics were much more important in Filipino culture than in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, they had like a couple of very popular strips, you know, like comedy, like newspaper strips. But in the Philippines, you know, it was actually because they're inexpensive, so it's really popular mass entertainment. You know, people might not have had TVs, definitely well, also, especially back then, you know, you might have one TV in the village or something. And, you know, it was something affordable that everybody could enjoy. And also there were a lot of Filipino myths, you know, that they passed on through comics. And you know, DC Comics had a lot of great imports.
well, Milestone and the media, like Marvel and DC Comics, I mean, how do they handle Asians differently than we handle Asians, you think?
Well, you know, I think it was definitely, Kwai was more multidimensional. I thought that there's still a dearth of Asian characters anywhere, unless, right? Unless you go in film or anything. So that it was great that she had her own title, I'll tell you. But I always felt like at Milestone, we were talking about it earlier, that it was very international, and I didn't feel like, you know, as much as we always talk about minority issues and all that, it felt like a real universe, you know, like in the world that I was living in, where there's a mix of people and different, you know, attitudes. And so I didn't really come in thinking about it like, oh, it's trying to represent different races and all.
Mm-hmm.
I really felt it was, and one of my favorite comics at Milestone was actually Shadow Cabinet. I thought that was like the coolest thing.
Iron Butterfly.
Concept, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, obviously I like a lot of them, but when we started working on that one, it was such a novel idea, and you know, just really exciting. Actually, when we moved to England, I discovered that the government here has a shadow cabinet. I mean, I'm sorry, I know you probably all knew that already, but I was like,
Everyone's a shadow cabinet.
actually, like, if they have a health minister, then they'll have a shadow health minister. I mean,
Wow.
it's so weird.
Yeah, Milestone got to do special events as well. Remember that Marvel and DC Comics do those like big events ad nauseum. But when Milestone did big events, they wanted to talk about real life issues. So they did the Long Hot Summer, which was a company-wide crossover where all the books talked about an event where people were going to get displaced. Paris Island, where all the poor folks lived, were going to get displaced by a big amusement park. So issues of gentrification, of police brutality, of protests and riots, all in one big book. Worlds Collide was a big company crossover with DC Comics. DC Comics, who is the host and the distributor of Milestone Media, let us play with their characters as well, as we play with Superman and all their DC like Superman titles. It was like a really fun thing. My best memory of that was when Blood Syndicate kicked Superman's butt. I'll always remember that. Now remember that all of this goodness came from a document known as the Milestone Bible. And let me show this to you. So this is the Bible. This one belongs to the Milestone universe with Static Shock and Blood Syndicate and all those characters and Icon. Basically, there is a document that has the environments, the supporting characters, the history of the characters, the different designs, plans out the years of the stories. This is what they took to DC Comics to make a deal of distribution with them. This is where they got their funding. The Milestone Bible was their big pitch, where all these towns, and not only the first four, there were other people involved as well, to create the Milestone Bible. And it went to about 3 different versions. The last version was the final Bible, which is the jumping point of all the modern Milestone Media comics, Blood Syndciate, Static, Icon, and Hardware, where they even allowed the first writers on the book, myself, Robert Washington, who did Static, and of course Dwayne, went in there and added odd stuff to it. And if you want to know a secret, before I got to Milestone, they had not created one Latino superhero. And that's the thing about diversity sometimes. Sometimes when people want to be diverse, they tend to think of one type of diversity. But Dwayne McDuffie, hired people to kind of go over this and kind of add more flavor to it and be more fair. So, with my advent at Milestone, we were able to have Latino characters, transgender characters. We had the first female to male transgender character in Blood Syndicate in a comic book. The first gay character to be featured as one of the leads in the comic book. We had a lot of diversity there, and he brought in people who knew about diversity to kind of put it in the books. And that was a blessing that Dwayne McDuffie personally bestowed on all of Milestone Media. True diversity. A little bit more about Dwayne McDuffie. The man was a genius. He had this vision, and he had this way of putting everything together and having it come out beautifully. He used his experience in the industry, kind of like a rough experience where he had to break a lot of barriers and hit glass ceilings, and he brought these people together who actually did some amazing work under him. He got an independent gay cartoonist to do their team book. He got a super nerd from his childhood, a friend who's also a genius, to write the Static book. I mean, he got like all these wonderful artists who were the first time actually debuting in these books, who are still stars today. He just had a way of seeing talent and seeing where directions go and trying new things that people didn't want to try before. And for that, he should receive all the awards and all the wishes and he should get a library named after him. He's no longer with us, but when he was here, he just basically broke the mold and changed the world. Dwayne McDuffie. This is one of the early sketches of the Blood Syndicate by Denys Cowen, when they were kind of designing, figure out who would be part of the team. Remember that this is one of the early versions, and it would change dramatically after I got there. And after Chris Cross got there, and after Dwayne started thinking about things, and after things started kind of putting things together. Remember, first sketches are basically the ideas, and then you start putting together and you start honing them into something that you want to put out there for the public. But how beautiful is this drawing? So Denys Cowen is one of the founding members of Milestone Media, who created an amazing assortment of comic books and an entire universe full of diverse, really for the first time in comics history, true diverse characters. So Denys, your hard work was beautiful. It's still like blooming flowers, thank goodness. And the question I wanted to ask you is, like, did you ever think that Milestone would change comics media the way it did? And how do you think it did change comics media in America, at least?
That's
Big
a good
question.
When we first started Milestone, I think our ambition was to change comics, if not forever, at least for the times, at least for the times that we were in, to change comics for those times. For the longest time after we ceased publishing, I wasn't convinced that we had made any kind of dent at all, except for, the Static Shock TV show and the success of that. I'm like, okay, well, we have one character that kind of did something, It wasn't until years later when I started running into the fans that the fans that had that are now in their 20s and 30s, who grew up with the cartoon, who were very influenced by it, and who grew up with the comics, who are now in the industry. And so I'm meeting a lot of people like that. I meet people at conventions who tell me how they grew up with these characters, their favorite characters, that it's some of their favorite characters. When I went to Brazil, I was very surprised because I went to Brazil in 2017 as a guest at one of the conventions there, Ivan, and I walk in and, you know, I'm like, okay, I got my question art here and I'm doing all this stuff. And immediately when I walked in the convention, I was surrounded by people. It was like I was this rock star or something. And I'm like, well, what's going on? Well, it turns out they knew that I was the creator, one of the creators of Static Shock. And Super Shock is huge in Brazil and a phenomenon. Like, so I was like this dude who created this phenomenon over there, had no idea. So all that to say is I feel the influence now in comics and amongst the professionals in comics and the fans more so than I ever did when we were first publishing or in the years in between. So it's been like a 30-year gap, but it's been an incredible thing to witness.
So I was very blessed to have Chris Cross on the team. Now, Chris Cross was this artist who basically walked into the office and showed his portfolio and was basically hired on the spot. First, he did some of the cards. Yes, we had trading cards. And then he did like third issue of Blood Syndicate. And I was so pleased and happy. And I begged to keep him on. And they seemed to love him a lot. And the rest was history. I mean, look how beautiful this art is. And he's still a powerhouse in the comics today. Marvel, DC Comics, and Dark Horse, and all other types of media. He's there. So this is Chris Cross, a great artist who first came to fame with Milestone Media as the one of the top artists in the world, and actually one of the greatest artists on Blood Syndicate ever. And you also did Heroes and stuff like that. So let me ask you this question: how do you think Milestone changed the comics game?
Well, I don't know. I can't even say that's a loaded question because I don't even think anything like Milestone had been out until Milestone came out. And answered a lot of questions and made a lot of people who were looking for representation of who they are in books in a correct way show itself in that medium, in the medium of comic books. I still remember when I was still trying to get into the game, and this really cool brother, Brian Marshall, hooked me up with this thought process about this group that was putting out a bunch of books that was basically geared for, well, there were Black creators that was putting out a certain amount of books for people of color. And they told me about this one particular character they created in a brick house. I'm like the song? He said, yeah, it's kind of this weird motif that they're playing with. And I thought it was so silly, there's no way I'd be drawing that book. Boy, what did I know, huh? So when I went to the offices to find out what was happening, funny enough, not only did I draw the character, I actually remade the character in a lot of ways too. So it was a good place to be able to sit down and be able to put your own, connotation, your own indentation about who you are as a person in that skin on those particular pages, and be able to have people come up to you and say, yo, that character looks like that. Just people walking around the streets of Dakota look just like people I've seen before. Yep. And what's cool is that if you're living in the hood, you see people all the time. And I actually had kind of the talent of being able to put a lot of people who I've seen before into books that weren't really, illustrative in the point where they look realistic, but it was something realistic about what I put there. So that was able to be something that was created, quote unquote, that woke market, if you want to call it that. All these people, I always call these woke people now kind of posers because we were doing the real deal. And we got these people actually, understanding what it was really about. And we didn't make a big deal about it. We just made people who they were. And that's what I think that was the mystique of Milestone, because it wasn't just Black people, it was just everyone under the sun getting equal billing. And that's something that wasn't happening right and throughout comic books. And we used to kind of, when I would go other places, when I left Milestone, I would kind of get joked about that, especially certain places in DC when it first started, about those books, you know, and I couldn't understand that. I was like, you know, well, we're doing it right. And we wanted to make sure that I wanted to make sure that I took with me, especially even nowadays, when I draw a person of color, that you can see Black people depicted in different colors. Like they're not just dark skin or light skin. You have a whole range. If you saw a person who was Asian, they will also be dark skin or caramel or really light skin.
Mhm.
You know, everyone has intonation. So when I see stuff like that, you always kind of go back to Milestone, because that just totally reshaped the market and the way comics were done. And nowadays, I think people will think they're being original when it really we were the one that started that whole bag. You know,
Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
I think you call us a legacy in a lot of ways.
Milestone Media brings back so many good memories. I think as any type of professional, this was like a very unique situation that I was blessed to be part of. What's nice about being a cartoonist who can draw as well and who can come on a team as a writer is that sometimes this cartoonist wants to design some of the characters. Because when you write, you know, for a cartoonist, you see the characters in your head and you have to sketch them down, and that's part of the writing process for me. So I was lucky that I got to kind of like have these characters, you know, drawn by the lead artist, but kind of blessed with some of my design as well. I mean, look how beautiful these covers are. I mean, Crisscross, Roberto Quijano was the inker on a lot of this stuff, and the coloring was so done. It was done by Michelle Wrightson, who's no longer with us, but was amazing colors back then. We had a lot of great colors on board as well. We had Julia Lachmont. We have, of course, Noel Giddings, who kind of like was one of the leads of the art department and the coloring department. I mean, it was just a lot of really good stuff coming out there. So hopefully you learn about Milestone's mission and the product they put out there, and let's kind of practice and let's put some diversity in our superhero characters. I guess the guiding flavor of Milestone Media and their comic books was the diversity, the multicultural aspect, right? So when you start sketching, creating your characters, for one thing, sketch a lot, draw a lot, play with the way people look around your neighborhood, in your family. That's really the best bet to kind of like capture diversity or representation in comics, okay? Remember that when people see themselves reflected, it kind of validates their existence, you know, it kind of makes them feel kind of interesting. So remember, I'm very basic when I draw, so I'm just going to show you my basic way. Circle, kind of like an oval, the spine, I'm going to give a little flavor to it. So the spine, remember that the spine carries all that body language. So the circle's like a balloon, the spine is the string, okay? The body goes around the string. So I'm going to create, I like to create women characters. Remember that, again, the strength of Milestone was the diversity, not only in ethnicity, multicultural origins and backgrounds, but also gender and orientation, which is very cool. I mean, back then, I don't think people were thinking about that, but Milestone kind of led the way. And I think even when Marvel and DC Comics kind of like were celebrated for having like 2 or 3 characters, you know, come out in one comic book or something like that and have a scene, you know, Milestone had whole entire issues and made them regular parts of characters in the books. Blood Syndicate, Static, that had the little boys, what little boys are made of arc in it. When you think about diversity, also think about diversity of body type. I'll play with that a little bit later. This is a female who I like to think her strength is kind of like one of her powers, okay? So remember, I'm doing a medium shot, so I'm not doing the entire figure, and I have the luxury of doing it on a graphic tablet, so I can make all sorts of changes. For instance, if I want to show you the whole body, here we go. But remember that when Milestone published the original years, like 26, 27 years ago, there was no graphic tablet software. There's no Clip Studio, no Manga Studio. They have Photoshop, and they had computers, the early Macs, which did a lot back then, but it was still kind of limited. So a lot of stuff was done by hand. A lot of paste up was done by hand. Let me see, letter L. Remember letter L for me? That's the way I do my feet. Kind of helps me with the heel to the toe and up, and kind of places it for me. See again, heel to the toe and up. When my process for doing characters, I just kind of doodle a lot. I think about the character, I think about the personality, where they come from, their family life. And little by little, that kind of like forms the character in my head for me. And then I play with it and I doodle and I kind of make different versions. When I like a version, I'll give myself a little check, and that's a version I'll keep running with. And sometimes I'll make a version of a character that's totally not the character. It's like, this is not the character I want, but I saved them because it might be good for another character. See, I'm making her more Latina. Curly hair. I love curly hair. I love so let's give her some natural stuff. Right now, I'm going to give her kind of like the little head wrap with the natural coming up on top of it. A little flow, you know. She looks pretty strong, huh? Let's give her those kind of like 90s shoulders. And these were pretty popular back then. You know, it's funny, when I designed Kwai, right? I gave her like these pagoda shoulders. And then I started thinking about it. It's like, is that offensive? But it looks so cool on her. So you know that her body is a little stockier, okay, which is very cool. Again, not those tiny waisted, long, lean bodies that they tend to have in the regular comic books. Let's see, it seems a little bit more military. Let's give it some boots. Let's give it some boots. And the eraser is your best friend, okay? Now, a lot of people, and I think Chris Cross taught me that, this whole idea of drawing like the body into shapes and kind of doing the outline first like that, like a skeleton, and doing the body around that. When you're drawing characters, again, think about, I'm going to change this foot like this, and then maybe change this heel. I think to point more inward. I think that's the problem right there, a little inward. So it looks like she's more in motion, okay? Okay. Like that, I change the crotch area. It was funny how when Chris Cross first drew Third Rail, right, and they had a shirtless scene or something like that. He had no nipples. So I was like, what happened? What happened to his nipples? And I got really, I was really adamant about adding nipples to it because, believe it or not, Marvel Comics had this way of kind of showing chests without male nipples for some reason. And it just seemed weird. It's like it made the character seem too fake for me. I thought, no, they're human. Put nipples on them, you know? So again, thinking about character of color, if you want to be very honest with your features and very respectful, trying to go away from caricature. And there's so many images on the internet now of beautiful people of color all over the place, and movie stars you enjoy, singers you enjoy. Let's make her counterpart, maybe her father. Let's make her father, an older man. By the way, age discrimination is a real thing in comics too. And a lot of characters, they should be a lot older, but they keep rebooting them to make them younger. I guess for their market, they think that teenagers don't want to read about older people. I don't know if that's entirely true, but for instance, Wonder Woman and Superman and Batman, it should be probably in the 80s or 90s now. It's kind of unfair that people don't get to see characters age. That's why stuff like the Hernandez brothers is so important. Hernandez brothers do the series Love and Rockets, a very wonderful, warm, beautifully drawn series of comic books, very Latinx, right? From the 80s, they aged their characters. Characters got older, they had families, they died, just some wonderful kind of like reality reflection in there. Okay, this is her father, maybe when he was younger, but let's make him a little older. Put some lines here and there, okay? So just a couple of edges here and there, be a little bit more respectful. So let's say that's her father, maybe he was a hero, that kind of thing. When you draw other characters, think about body types, right? Now, there's a quick way of doing body types. For instance, the basic shape, right? Triangles, like that, squares, round squares. this is kind of a way of thinking. If you make someone who's more top heavy, like in most superheroes and comics are very built on top, think about that and make them a little bit more stockier. You can get away with making the legs a little smaller, kind of like the gorilla shape. Because that's the thing, particularly when people who really build up their bodies that large, they tend to, a lot of times they forget about the legs a little bit, or their proportions come out, look a little off. Not off, just different, all right? If you're gonna do chubbier people, let's make her sister, her half-sister, let's make her a half-sister, all right? But family structures are very different. Let's make her a little chubbier. Chubbier bodies. This person is more Zoftig in that Marilyn Monroe kind of way. All right. So you can kind of play with the shapes. Let's do an inverted triangle. No, this way. Okay. So again, making a rounded person. Be respectful. You know, there's a comic book Faith, which is kind of cool. It has a larger shaped woman. So you can make guys that way too, and it's just a body type, okay? Everyone has a genetic predisposition, so it's nice to have variety in the characters you create, okay? And I like that you can make larger people do action as well. You know, a lot of times they get left out, especially in the movies. You'll see them do a lot of action. Okay, let's give her. I'm gonna give horns. She's half Filipina, half demon. How about that? Sounds like somebody up the neighborhood. Okay. Let's give her some good hair. Good hair. Look how that sneaks in. The colonialism sneaks into me. Good hair, bad hair. I just meant like good shape of hair. Remember, like one of those, and we talked about that in Blood Syndciate too. The whole idea of good hair and bad hair, how colonial that is, how that's kind of like a vestige of slavery. How hair that's more towards Caucasian hair is considered, you know, good, and how hair that's more towards African hair is considered bad, which is a horrible thing when you think about it. Thank God things are changing so quickly now. But here, okay, let's make her. I said I'm gonna make her a little bigger, so let's go with the chin and go more down. All right, there we go. Beautiful eyes. I'm gonna give her some marks. Give some tribal marks. Give her some Taino flavor. And by the way, Tainos still exist. They're in our DNA. Tainos were the people in the Caribbean before Columbus came. And although they try to wipe them out, they still exist not only in Latino and African blood in the Caribbean, in Jamaica and Haiti and Dominican Republic. Let's give her short hair. But they're also in Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans, right? They're a lot of their DNA, a big chunk of it too, which is nice. Very interesting. Also, there's a lot of the culture still there. A lot of our language comes from the Taino stuff. You know, stuff like that. Just keep on like that. Remember, if you're drawing Asian characters, Milestone really excelled in that. Zombie was about a Korean character who was infused with these nanobots that kept his body alive, but needed substance to keep going. It was really kind of like an interesting horror story. Yeah, drawing Asian characters. Remember, Asian characters have different features depending where they're from. They could be South Asian, Indonesian, Malaysian, which is closer to India and Africa. Very tribal, indigenous color, like Filipinos. Filipinos are also Latino because of the colonization by the Spaniards. Japanese has a different flavor. Korean has a different flavor. Chinese different flavor. Just be respectful. Know your history if you're going to go into the fantasy stuff, because there are a lot of really beautiful, deep Asian legends. From all countries have their own different flavors. You know, if you're going to use that, just be respectful. Just like you're going to be respectful when you use any kind of African legends, or, you know, Caribbean legends, or even Russian legends and stuff like that, Baba Yaga and stuff like that. Be respectful, kind of read up on it, try to find out sources, and have fun, okay? You know, of course, Milestone had their own problems, but every comic book company does. Whether perhaps a few trouble spots of communication between the hosting distributing company of DC Comics with the more kind of like progressive styles of Milestone creators and editors and publishers. The fact that, as wonderful as it was for a few years, sometimes things do fall apart. But for what they were, no other company has ever created as many people of color, many characters of color, many diverse people of color. Not only people of color, people of different sexual orientations and gender identities. Milestone really broke the barrier back then, and they still have. I mean, it's now the other companies are trying to catch up now, but Milestone was the first, and so far it's been the best.